My name is Simon Newnham and I head up the trade branch in the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator for today's session, and I have the real luxury of having such a terrifically strong panel to talk to you today about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and in particular whether it's going to gain favour in Asia and whether it's going to gain favour in the US Congress. In terms of the structure that we'd like to follow today, we're going to start with Richard and move through Ambassador Beasley and then end with Carlos. And I think what you'll find is with this range of perspectives and experience, you'll hear a little bit about some of the technicalities of the negotiations, where they're headed, what it will mean for setting trade rules in the region. And then from Ambassador Beasley, you'll hear particularly about some of the sort of geopolitics involved in the TPP negotiations, why countries are attracted to it, how it hooks the US into Asia. And then I think very importantly, because we often sort of strangely forget this part of the equation, what would a TPP deal mean for business, for US business? What's in it for them? Why are they pushing so hard to get this agreement going? So just to give a little bit of scene setting before I pass to Richard, you all know, I don't need to tell you just how amazing the economic story is in Asia, and I don't need to tell you just how much US and other businesses are involved already in Asia. But what often gets overlooked here is those same businesses are demanding better trade and investment rules in Asia. And they're knocking on the doors of their governments and saying, you need to update and modernise and make more transparent the rules that we're operating in Asia. You need to give us confidence in our investments and our trade relationships in the region. So getting the rules right is extremely important. And just to, if I can indulge for a moment on Australia's perspective here, successive governments in Australia have been heavily involved in getting that right architecture in Asia. Most recently, we've just landed 3 big trade agreements, hard-fought, tough trade agreements with our North Asian trading partners, Korea, South Korea, Japan, and China in that order. Very ambitious, very hard-fought, but we've landed those deals, and they're very important to Australian companies. It's a never-ending effort. You achieve one agreement, you want to go a step further. It's like a never-ending pathway of trying to liberalise trade rules and improve the investment environment in our region. And that's, of course, why we are so heavily invested in the TPP. Others will talk about this more at length, but for those that don't follow it closely, 12 countries in the region negotiating to try and get better trade rules and investment rules in Asia. It's been going, it's had different incarnations, but basically the current group, the bulk of the current group has been negotiating for about 5 years. I did want to just touch for a moment on where the US is positioned. Others will sort of expand on this, but just to set the scene for you. I've been based in Washington for 2 years. I spent a lot of my time following the TPP negotiations and Trade Promotion Authority, which is very carefully and closely linked with the TPP. It would be the case, I think, this is as good a time as I've seen it in the time that I've been in Washington in terms of those two processes coming to a head. The negotiations are down to, frankly, the last few issues. It's getting really close, it's the tough stuff, but the end is in sight, and Ambassador Froman, the United States Trade Representative, has said he can see a deal coming together in the negotiations within 2 months. That's on the negotiations themselves. On Trade Promotion Authority, which is the US legislative instrument that facilitates the passing of trade legislation, there have been some very positive signals, particularly since the midterm elections in November last year. Very positive signals from the White House, from the President, from committee chairs on the Hill about the efforts that are going in to pass Trade Promotion Authority. And just last week in the State of the Union, the President spent a bit of time on this, outlining why it was important that the US sort of achieve that. So against that backdrop, I think what I'll do is we'll pass to each of the speakers to give a couple of minutes of comments, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I might pass first to Professor Steinberg.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Cal and Karen, for the opportunity to share some thoughts today on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its prospects for approval in the United States. In my view, there is little doubt that the TPP will be approved and implemented by the United States Congress for 3 reasons. First, it's going to have net economic benefits for the United States. Second, it's going to benefit some very powerful domestic U.S. interests. And third, it's an important geoeconomic move for the United States. I want to break this down into four points. First, that the TPP will have a net economic benefit for the United States. This, of course, is what would be predicted by economic theory, and the basic idea is that as foreign tariffs and trade barriers are diminished, there'll be more opportunities for U.S. firms to sell abroad, and while some of our inefficient import-competing producers will suffer, the increased efficiency from trade liberalization will improve U.S. welfare measured by such things as gross domestic product, GDP, and employment. The economic benefits, however, can be expected to be smaller than one might think from the sheer number and population of countries participating in the TPP. The reason for this is that of the 12 countries, the United States already has a free trade agreement with 6 of them. Moreover, all the countries are WTO members, and so the baseline, the threshold of openness that they already have is a pretty high threshold. So it's not as if we are suddenly gaining access to huge markets that have long shut us out completely. More precisely, the expected magnitude of benefits, the number that is most commonly thrown around, and I think is a very credible figure, is that the TPP will boost U.S. GDP by $78 billion by 2025. That translates to a bit under 0.5% GDP increase over these 10 years, which means roughly 450,000 jobs by 2025. Now, 450,000 jobs is not a trivial number, but if you come to realize that this is taking place over 10 years, it means the TPP is going to create about 3,800 jobs a month in a country which in the last year has created about 250,000 jobs a month. So you know, I suspect that the economic growth that's going to result from this is not going to match the political rhetoric that we're likely to hear over the next 3, 6, 9 months as Congress deals with this. Nonetheless, the fact remains that it is evident that the TPP will be beneficial to the U.S. economy as a whole. The second point is that while the TPP will benefit the U.S. economy as a whole, it will have distributive consequences such that some elements of the U.S. economy and some U.S. workers will do very well, while others will suffer. This is true of all liberalization, trade liberalization agreements. So U.S. businesses that are globally efficient and competitive are going to benefit from open foreign markets: corn, wheat, soybeans, beef, pork, U.S. software, pharmaceuticals, machine tools, financial services, banking, telecoms, and insurance. These are export-oriented, comparatively efficient U.S. industries. At the same time, those businesses that are not competitive, that are largely import competing, are going to be hurt. Some manufacturing jobs are going to be lost, particularly in U.S. industries that employ unskilled and semi-skilled workers who are paid wages that just can't compete with wages in Malaysia or Vietnam. So especially in things like textiles and apparel, low-value steel, automobile, and light truck assembly. The point is that the TPP is a net positive, but that means there will be winners and losers. There will be more winners than losers, and the winners will be in jobs that are relatively high paying, but that is of little consolation to the workers who lose their jobs, who have semi-skilled or unskilled jobs, and can't easily move over to where the new jobs are being created. This brings me to my third point, that all of the foregoing suggests that when the TPP negotiations are completed, the agreement will likely sail through Congress. In Washington politics, the important thing is not that the TPP is a net economic benefit to the United States. What is going to drive the TPP through Congress is the political power of the winners, of those businesses and trade associations and voters that stand to benefit from it. Corn, wheat, soybeans, beef, pork may constitute only about 5% of U.S. GDP, but it means 40 votes in the United States Senate. Banking, insurance, telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, software, these sectors have lobbying war chests in Washington that are second to none. To be sure, they're going to be opposed by probably organized labor, some environmentalists, some businesses, some sectors that are going to lose from this, but those losers from the agreement are going to be dwarfed in political power by those who stand to gain. Most House Democrats with strong ties to organized labor are going to vote against this. most or all Republicans in both houses with no ties to labor, many from farm states, and all of whom receive generous campaign support from some of these industries, they're going to vote for the TPP. And they're going to vote first for Trade Promotion Authority, and the result is that will be the same that we've seen for every trade agreement presented in the last 40 years to the United States Congress, which is that it passes. A year from now, I predict we will all be Trans-Pacific partners. My fourth and final point is that what will be lost in this political debate, though it will likely be discussed here, is the historical importance of the TPP. Its importance is not in how many or how few jobs will be created in the United States in the next 10 years. The real significance is going to be that the TPP has a geoeconomic logic. It will be a template for an essentially Western path to continued economic globalization, a path that could lead to far more substantial increases in US GDP. So assuming we want our successful post-war economic strategy of seeking economic growth through trade liberalization to continue, how do we achieve that? There are basically three paths. WTO. WTO has been deadlocked, certainly deadlocked in the Doha round, largely due to, from an American perspective, from the stance of leading developing countries, the BRICS in particular, whose economic structure and ideology is different from that of the United States and our Western partners. These are countries where the state plays a more intrusive role in the economy, okay? So the second alternative has been the US path that we've been on for the last, since the late 90s, which is competitive liberalization, bilateral free trade agreements that we've now established with about 20 countries. This path has moved slowly and has created its own problems. We haven't moved nearly as quickly as, say, the European Union, and we're suffering some trade and investment diversion as a result of it. The European Union has free trade agreements with about 100 countries now. And while we had hoped to eventually ratchet up these bilateral agreements to multilateralize them in the WTO, we're unable to do that. We're blocked there by the developing countries. And now with over 500 free trade agreements in the world, the complexity for business is astonishing, right? Just charting these relationships and who has free trade with whom looks like and is often referred to as a spaghetti bowl, okay? Navigating that for business is extremely difficult. And so we're moving to a regional trade agreement strategy whereby like-minded countries in Asia Pacific will join together through the TPP, and the United States will conclude a trade agreement at the same time with the 28 EU countries to create the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP. It is possible that someday these two agreements could join together. Hopefully they will be largely consistent, and from what I've seen so far, they are largely consistent. The result of that will be that we've created a deeply liberalized multilateral trade regime from which no other WTO member can easily afford exclusion, not China, not Brazil, not Russia, not India. And those who want to join these arrangements are going to have to assume the responsibilities of deep liberalization, including the state enterprises chapter and competition chapters of the TPP and TTIP. A geoeconomic shift of this magnitude would result in a GDP increase substantially more than we're talking about, or an order of magnitude more. I mean, we're talking in different scenarios when these general equilibrium models are run of 5, 6, 7% increases, and those are in fact tectonic shifts. So this makes the simultaneous pursuit of the TPP and the TTIP a strategic move of monumental significance, certainly the most important since the establishment of the WTO in 1995. I want to note that this is very different from much of the geostrategic rhetoric suggested by some as a basis for the TPP. Some politicians are suggesting that TPP is part of a pivot aimed at containing China. China certainly, to some degree, has seen this to be the case. This is a wrong interpretation. If we were building an economic bloc aimed at containing or confronting China, we would at least include India in the TPP. In response to China's military buildup, its aggressive rhetoric, and its clear revisionist ambitions, the United States has been and should increase engagement with India, but India is not part of the TPP, and despite claims to the contrary, the TPP is not driven by China's revisionist ambitions. It's consistent with the pivot, but it's not driven by the pivot. It is instead a geoeconomic alternative to the WTO and bilateralism. It's a path towards further globalization. It is leaving behind not just China, but India, Russia, and Brazil as well. And so while the debate in Washington is going to swirl around near-term job losses and gains and effects on various sectors and on the U.S. economy, 50 years from now, historians are not going to be spilling ink about that. They're instead going to focus on this as a geoeconomic path that is being taken this year by the United States, our partners in Asia Pacific, Europe, an effort to continue liberalization on a global scale, largely in line with a revived Washington consensus.
Thank you, Richard. That was excellent. I really appreciate that. I'm sure that's got some people thinking about some questions for later on. I'm going to pass now to Ambassador Beasley, who, amongst his many traits, is my long-suffering boss, so I'm on my best behaviour today. Ambassador Beasley.
Well, that is the best exposition of the case for the TPP that I've heard in the United States to this point. So I hope you were actually taking in what Richard had to say, because that fundamentally is the argument, stripped of the politics that surround it. And it is the introduction, effectively, of a set of global trading rules that give the best possible chance to all participants in the system to the Asia-Pacific area. Because what we're actually dealing with here is the people who are not involved in the Bretton Woods agreements that set up the international trading system. At that time, most of the participants in this, obviously not the United States, but most were either defeated powers, one way or another, in the Asian region or colonies. And therefore, the sense of ownership among them of the rules that currently dominate, or we want to see dominate international trade, are not things with which they identify. So this is a really essential part of incorporation of the fastest growing region of the globe into the trading system on a basis that they are comfortable with, that they comprehend and that they agree with the United States at the centre of it. I'm only ambassador here at this moment because of this. Were it not for the fact that the US Congress was going to consider, in my view, they probably will consider the TPP this year, I would have long since gone home. This is so, to my mind, so absolutely critical to the future happiness and prosperity of the United States that those who are true friends of the United States have to stay here and work for this. It helps Australia a bit, but not much. We've got free trade agreements with virtually every, including the United States, with virtually every power that's in the conversation for the TPP, and some beyond it, and some who will join it subsequently, as I think China will ultimately, once the thing is negotiated. So when I came here 5 years ago, the first place I appeared was before the Federal Trade Commission, who were conducting a hearing then in the early phases of the TPP. And my opening remarks were that the prosperity, happiness and strength of the American people were an Australian national interest. And that therefore we considered that supporting the United States being part of this was critical to us. Americans do not understand the massive increase in prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. They do not really fully understand how absolutely critical it is that America engage in the debate in the zone. There are 580 million members of the global middle class now resident in Asia, not resident in the TPP negotiators, but in the totality of the region. In 15 years' time, that will be 3 billion. It'll move from being 20% of the global middle class to being 60% of the global middle class in 15 short years. Those who will prosper at that point of time will be those who are seamlessly interconnected with this market. Those who will be checked to a degree will be those who are not. So this is an American middle class interest as well as an American national interest. The American middle class has been pounded into the ground over the course of the last 30 years. The argument that is made in the public domain about how hard it has been coping with the consequences of globalisation in technology, in the establishment of multinational businesses, in the decline of trade union coverage and the like. There's a whole multiplicity of factors, but all of them have transpired to make life extraordinarily difficult for the American middle class. The last 30 years, there's been no real increase in American middle class wages. In the last 10 years, there's been a 50% increase in Australian middle class wages. This is the opportunity. The American economy has been driven by domestic consumption for a long period of time, but the capacity of domestic consumption to provide that all ships rising prosperity across the United States is diminishing. This is a chance to change that. This is a chance to, if you like, to put it crudely, acquire somebody else's middle class in order that you might be able to prosper yourselves. So that is that's a substantial part of the argument that's going to be made. I wish I'm replacing Congressman Berman. I wish he was here because he would have a very realistic perspective on what the chances are of these pieces of legislation in Congress. But, and he will, even though he's no longer in Congress, I think he'll have some influence with his Democratic colleagues. Because if this is going to go through, it's going to need 50 or 60 Democrat votes in the House and proportionately a substantially greater number of Democrat votes in the Senate, in all probability. So this is the politics of this, which Richard knows more than I, are really very important. The final point I'd make is this. This is not a negotiation taking place in a vacuum. This is not as though if this falls apart, we can all go back and say, well, let's sit back and have a quiet think about this and, maybe we can find another angle to get in on this. The region that we're talking about here has a whole series of competitive trade propositions being put before them and a whole series of competitive bilateral and multilateral agreements being arrived at. The United States does not influence the rules in this area in the direction of that open trading system that has been so critical to global prosperity since the 1940s, then other rules will prevail. There will be rules, but those rules will not be favourable to American product or American economic interests.
Terrific. Thank you, Ambassador, very much. And then finally to Carlos, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from a West Coast business perspective what the TPP might mean for some of your members. Thank you.
Thank you. Just allow me to start by saying that about 4 years ago, the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, together with the Brookings Institution in Washington, we decided to do a lot of studies and research analysis about why our companies in Southern California are not participating in global markets. And the conclusion of this research that took almost a year is that the world knows about Los Angeles. They know where we are. They know everything about us. Our executives do not know the global markets. Our executives do not know how to play in global trade and global investment. And as such, together with Brookings, the Chamber decided to develop a lot of initiatives primarily to promote exports, imports, and foreign investment. The Chamber is one of the largest chambers in the country, certainly one of the largest in California also as well. Our international programs are designed primarily for small and medium-sized companies because we want them to participate in global trade. The concentration of manufacturing companies in Southern California is the largest in the country. We have more manufacturing firms in Southern California than in the Midwest, but these executives do not participate, as I said before. So our role is to promote international trade by looking, obviously, the Pacific Rim and Asia as our top trading partner. The region of Southern California, or Los Angeles District Export, or the District district, the customs district, is made up of the Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, and the Los Angeles World Airports. This area handles over $400 billion of trade every year. This is exports and imports with the world. $340 billion is with Asia and the Pacific Rim. $40 billion is with Europe. Between 18 to 20 with Latin America, and probably less than $2 or $3 billion with Africa. So clearly, our commercial interest is in trade with the Pacific Rim and Asia. However, we have a big concern. Trade with China is almost half of what we do. It's about $170 billion of trade that we do. So again, it is our interest here at the Chamber in Southern California to begin participating in more free trade agreements, because we need to diversify our activities in global markets and not depend on one single country. Our business executives are thrilled, and we hope that the TPP and other free trade agreements will pass. And the reason for that is because small and medium-sized executives love to do business with countries that they have free trade agreements with the United States. The free trade agreements will set a parameter, a legal parameter, in which your negotiation will begin and start. And so it is almost like a safety blanket that a lot of executives have. So again, we encourage our Congress and everyone else involved. Our executives, again, they like to do business with the free trade agreements. And my final point is that obviously we are very interested also in the free trade agreements, because this is a way in which it gives us transparency in our negotiations, protection in our intellectual property, and obviously gives us ability to grow economically, more jobs here. The only concern that we have with all the agreements that the U.S. government has signed in the past 20, 25 years is that our government sometimes is very timid in terms of enforcing the laws and the regulations and the negotiations. So we're always very bullish also as well in talking to the USTR and other government agencies who say, look, negotiate an agreement in good faith, sign the agreement in good faith, but also make sure that you are looking at the enforcement of these agreements. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Carlos. So, look, before we flick out to the audience, I did have a couple of questions for the panel. Anyone can feel free to answer. The first one has to do with future membership. Someone once told me that many years ago, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, was portrayed as a platform for the region, that these three countries would conclude a free trade agreement and then additional members would come on board to that, and it would form the platform for the region. Now, some countries did try to join NAFTA and were unsuccessful. So one of the things I think that would be really important from Australia's perspective, of course, is that the TPP has currently 12 countries negotiating it, but of course central to the success of that sort of agreement is future members in the Asia-Pacific region joining the TPP after it's concluded. And I just want to throw to the panel, to what extent do you see the chances of a second tranche of countries, ASEAN countries, Korea, etc., joining the TPP in the future?
My sense is that that's likely to happen, but that, and the hope is that eventually this template of rules will be adopted by an even larger group of countries. The question is for some particularly big players, namely China, when and on what terms. Some people are already advocating for early inclusion of China, and certainly economists are crunching the numbers of what the consequences will be. I think that we are much better off, and this is the counter argument, building a critical mass of countries that adhere to and sign up to this particular template, and that therefore presents something of a fait accompli to China about the terms on which it will join.
Just looking at it from the inside, the Chinese attitude 5 years ago was totally different to the Chinese attitude now. You know, when one heard from one's diplomatic colleagues and when you examined the cable traffic on attitudes that were being expressed back then 5 years ago, unquestionably in the mind of the Chinese, this is all about containment. And it was about doing them serious damage strategically, if not necessarily economically. That's gone. That has gone from the Chinese assessment. The assessment now is a more quizzical one. A, will this be achieved or will it just fall apart? Will the Americans actually be able to get that through? And B, if they do, then how do we go about the process of figuring out entree? I don't actually think that would happen very quickly because the standards that are aspired to here are really tough in terms of a managed economy in getting themselves actually into. But that there would be a discussion take place, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind at all. I think some countries would come in very fast. I think there'd be a very quick interest in Indonesia, there'd be quick interest in South Korea, and probably you'd see a number of quite powerful players come in. Because they're quite fascinated, certainly the Indonesians are, with the Vietnamese involvement in all of this. But the others would come in much more slowly, but it would be the issue. From that point on, if this is created, the issue for many of the countries in South and Southeast Asia is when and on what terms do we join this?
We welcome countries to join the agreements. From the perspective of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce and dealing with the small and medium-sized companies, the challenge that we have is discussing with them the mechanics of how to do international trade. And a lot of times for us, as a chamber, obviously, we are not a governmental entity. We have a big challenge. So the big challenge is that there are so many agreements in the Pacific Rim that a lot of executives get confused. Just allow me to give you some acronyms. You have the Asia-Pacific Trade Agreement, the ASEAN FTA, the South Asia FTA, the TPP. You have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You have the China-Japan-Korea agreement. You have the FTAAP, which is the Free Trade Agreement of Asia-Pacific. You have the U.S. government has 14 free trade agreements in the region and a great number of trading investment frameworks agreement. And now we have the Pacific Alliance coming up with Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. So our executives trying to make decisions how to operate for us is a big challenge, because maybe a challenge and opportunity, because we need to come up with more seminars. But again, I would like to place this on the table about the fact that we are confused.
We can get an alphabet out of this, provided somebody can come up with an X. Have you got any ideas that we could sort of have an X come into one of the titles of these treaties, and then we'll have the whole alphabet?
I think that's a really interesting point, the disconnect between all these different trade rules that exist around the world and businesses actually utilising these trade rules. And it brings me to an important question. Many people think the TPP kind of grew out of or was spurred on by the failures in Geneva. Richard's already alluded to this in detail. The failure of world trade talks to actually take forward trade rules. That would easily be the most sort of wide-ranging benefits to countries around the world if we could get the Doha talks, some form of the Doha talks moving forward. So because they had collapsed and failed, or at least gone into the freezer, if you like, for some time, things like the TPP gained status and gained momentum. So here's my question to the panel. Can you imagine a situation where the TPP concludes, new members join, and some of the standards and rules that are achieved there are brought into a Geneva context or brought into a broader free trade agreement zone of the Asia Pacific, which is something China and the US, frankly, have been pushing for?
I don't know, but I will tend to believe that I'm not a scholar. I am in the trenches doing business every day, but for whatever I can read, a lot of material indicates that maybe the free trade agreement of Asia Pacific could be the group that maybe will bring us all together. However, my own reading tells me that perhaps China is becoming a leader in the FTAAP, and in the U.S. is the leader on the TPP. And so my question maybe, or comment to the panelists, and maybe to all of you also as well, to see if in fact, well, whatever we read at the chamber is real, in the sense that maybe we can say that the FTAAP has become a potential counterweight for the TPP.
Interesting. Richard?
Oh, the WTO is the gold standard. We really do need to conclude WTO-based agreements. It's an absolute tragedy that the last 10, 15 years that's proved impossible. I don't think the TPP impacts one way or the other, Simon, but I certainly don't think it detracts from the capacity to arrive at a WTO-type agreement. Perhaps psychologically, the fact that people are doing deals may impel some of those who've been impeding WTO agreements, and there's quite a small number of powers indeed of doing it, might be shifted on the basis of that, but I don't know it well enough to make a judgment.
So, again, I think the hope is that we can ratchet up these rules and multilateralize them. And there are sort of two paths that are being taken, and the question is whether those paths will converge in the WTO or not. Okay, so the first path is this TPP, TTIP path, right? These rules that essentially express openness and liberalization, and with a very limited state role in the economy. And so one hope is that if you get a critical mass of countries to join that set of rules, then the countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, which aren't currently willing to accept them, will suffer essentially so much trade and investment diversion that they will need to join. Okay, so if one looks at these general equilibrium models, right, they show the positives for the Australias and the United States in terms of GDP effects, but they show negatives for the countries that are excluded, right? They can't get into our markets on the same terms that we are going to be able to get into each other's markets. So one path that is conceptualized is common set of rules. This trade investment diversion incentivizes everyone to join, in which case, yes, eventually it gets to the WTO. There's another possibility, however, and that possibility is that China, India in particular, go on their, and some of these other countries go on their own path, and the paths diverge. So China is forming this RCEP. It's going to have its own set of rules. Will these paths diverge? Will India and China's growth be such that, that the trade and investment diversion that's created by our path just isn't a big enough deal for them? That the trade creation created by their own path is plenty good, in which case we end up with a single multilateral system, the WTO, which has a certain baseline of openness, and embedded within that multiple systems.
Right.